nation will endure as it has endured.
Our long national nightmare is over.
Give me a break. That's a bunch of malarkey.
Hello, welcome to Planet America. I'm John Barron.
I'm Shasta Shadella.
This week, Republicans resurgent in Virginia. Does Trump get the credit? Does Biden get the blame? Or is something else going on? We'll ask former Alaska Senator Mark Begich.
And we're going to be looking at the potentially critical race there is playing in American politics and bringing the latest from the Glasgow Climate Summit. But first...
Democrats are in disarray, dreading their electoral prospects for next year and anxious about their ability to govern until then. Republican businessman Glenn Youngkin swept to victory in Virginia's gubernatorial race this week, defeating former governor and Democratic Party insider Terry McAuliffe by around 2.5 points. It was a remarkable comeback for the grand old party in an increasingly Democratic state, which Joe Biden won by 10 points just 12 months ago. McAuliffe spent much of his lacklustre campaign trying to paint Youngkin as a Trump clone. Youngkin managed to secure the former president's endorsement and hold on to his base while winning back suburban moderates, proving perhaps that Republicans can find a winning formula with a kind of Trump light, focusing on cultural issues around education without overtly pandering to racism. For his part, the former president claimed credit. He did endorse Youngkin. He was definitely not asked to campaign for him in person, though.
All McAuliffe did was talk Trump, 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 and he lost. What does that tell you? Fake news? I guess people running for office as Democrats won't be doing that too much longer.
We'll see about that. The new Lieutenant Governor of Virginia will be Republican Winsome Sears, a Jamaican-born 57-year-old former Marine who is a gun rights, anti-abortion conservative and about to become the first woman of colour to hold statewide office in Virginia, which of course once hosted the capital of the pro-slavery Confederacy.
I'm telling you that what you are looking at is the American dream. The American dream.
Fair to say Democrats have been fretting somewhat over Virginia for several weeks, but they were much more confident of victory in New Jersey, where Progressive Governor Phil Murphy was standing for re-election. Some polls suggested it might be a tight race. Others, though, gave Murphy a double-digit lead. Well, it was tight, all right. Republican Jack Ciattarelli played on resentment over COVID, some Democrat complacency perhaps, drove up turnout and came close to a massive upset, all while distancing himself from Donald Trump, not seeking his endorsement. In the end, it was a squeaker. The Democrat ahead by 0.8 of a percentage point when the Associated Press finally called it for Phil Murphy, who becomes the first Democrat re-elected to a second term since the 1970s. Meanwhile, friend of the show, Democrat Eric Adams has been elected Mayor of New York City this week, just the second African-American to hold that office. As expected, the former police captain and Brooklyn Borough President comfortably defeated Republican candidate Curtis Sliwa, a talk show host and, you might recall, founder of the Guardian Angels, a 1990s citizens law enforcement organisation that briefly operated here in Australia as well. After his victory, Adams, who campaigned as a Biden-style moderate, called for unity.
We are so divided right now, and we're missing the beauty of our diversity. We have to end all of this division of who we are, where we go to worship, what do we wear. No, today we take off the intramural jersey and we put on one jersey, Team New York.
In other electoral news, in the city of Boston, voters elected Progressive Democrat Michelle Wu as their next mayor. The 36-year-old city councillor is the first woman, the first person of colour and the first Asian American ever elected to that office. Wu didn't campaign on her race or gender, but she acknowledged its significance after her win. And that's a break with the past for another reason as well, because Michelle Wu is the first Boston mayor since the 1930s not to come from an Irish American or Italian American background. So all in all this week, good results for Republicans, good for diversity in America as well. Plenty of food for thought for Democrats, hoping to avoid a midterm shellacking next November. But at least, Chaz, when Republicans win, all of a sudden we're not hearing claims of election fraud and vote ringing. So there's that.
There is that. I did note the contribution from Newt Gingrich with dread just before the votes started being counted.
It's going to be very historic. Does Youngkin need to win for this to have the maximum impact? What if it's really tight?
No, if it's real, look, if it's first of all, it's really tight, they'll steal it. So you can't afford to have a really tight election.
Well, it was pretty tight in the end, but no word as yet on whether Newt Gingrich has turned over a new leaf after being proven categorically wrong. I've got a good feeling about this one, John. But what to make of it all? Well, first, I think John noted the clearest takeaway, which is that it's taken less than a year for Republicans to escape Trump's shadow if they want to escape Trump's shadow. Terry McAuliffe did everything he could to connect Youngkin to Trump, short of tying the guy down and literally stapling a yellow gerbil to the top of his head. But it didn't work. These are from the exit polls. Trump's favourability in Virginia was 41%, but Youngkin's was 53%. They see him as his own man. So the Democrats are going to have to come up with a plan B, I'm afraid. Even more concerning for Democrats, there doesn't seem to be just one or two areas where Youngkin made ground on them. He enjoyed swings everywhere. Look at that map. Each of those red arrows represents a small swing to the Republicans. Note, there isn't a single blue arrow on the whole map. But it's not like the Democrats were so discouraged that they didn't show up. In fact, about 190,000 more Democrats showed up this year than showed up back in 2017 to stick it up Trump. It's just that 500,000 more Republicans showed up as well. The Republicans won this election through superior motivation, not through Democratic demoralisation. A lot of people have also focused on poll numbers like these, showing parents of school children supporting Youngkin by 15 points, whereas people who weren't parents were supporting McAuliffe by 1. That was the week before the election, by the way. And indeed, education was considered one of the 2 top issues in almost every poll. Left-wing commentators then drew their own conclusions from that.
The exit polls showed that the coronavirus, or that the virus, was a very low importance to many of the voters there. It was education, which is code for white parents don't like the idea of teaching about race.
Look, I don't know about that, though. I'm not sure it was all about race. Youngkin didn't air a single radio or TV ad about immigration at a time when the American border is a mess. There's MAGA types heading down to the border for photo ops all the time. He didn't mention the issue once. And of course, his ticket included a black woman and a Cuban-American man. I saw one interesting take about the education focus of this campaign, which I thought maybe. That was that COVID connects the economy and education. So it's like 3 issues in one because of school lockdowns. They were a massive issue in Virginia until quite recently. That might be part of why parents are feeling ignored at the moment. It also seems likely that what we saw yesterday was a reaction to national events, in my view, because they weren't talking about education in New Jersey, where Governor Murphy almost lost re-election after winning by 14 points back in 2017. Republicans saw success in elections pretty much everywhere. In fact, New Jersey's longest-running state Senate president may well lose his seat to a truck driver who spent $153 on his entire campaign. So that gives you some idea of the kind of tailwind that Republicans are currently enjoying. It's not really a big surprise either, is it? Joe Biden's now in the low 40s in most approval polls. Growth is languishing at about 2%. We told you a few weeks ago about the supply crisis, that there were 60 ships stuck offshore at Los Angeles' ports. Well, now there are 77 ships stuck out there waiting. It's getting worse. Petrol prices through the roof. Although, as always with America, we do need to translate these supposedly sky-high gas prices to numbers that we all understand, namely 90 cents a litre. Yep, that's what they're flipping out about in America, 90 cents a litre. But inflation is no laughing matter, still stuck above 5%. And interestingly, when people are judging the strength of the economy, they don't use the stock market as an indicator, and they no longer even use the unemployment rate as an indicator either. Now they're using the prices of goods and services that they buy as their prime indicator of the strength of the economy, by quite a long way as well. So you can see how the economy is really not doing the Democrats any favours right now.
I'm just relieved that no gerbils got stapled to heads. That's the good news of the week. Now to so-called critical race theory, which, according to Tucker Carlson on Fox News,
teaches their kids to hate their country and to judge their classmates based on how they look, on their skin color.
Tucker and his fellow Foxes have been warning about critical race theory for months and months. It's been discussed literally hundreds of times.
Parents all over the country are standing up to the threat of critical race theory.
And that kind of blanket coverage on Fox News helped to make it a big issue in this week's Virginia election.
All right, the battle over critical race theory in our public schools has become a major flashpoint in one place in particular, ground zero, the Virginia governor's race.
And it's not just Virginia or America. Concerns about critical race theory have spread to Australia too.
This is what they're teaching. It's about decolonisation. This is the post-colonisation and critical race theory in social work.
Yeah. Although I'm not sure that everyone who's upset about critical race theory actually knows why they're upset, John.
What's the most important issue in the governor's race here in Virginia?
Getting back to the basics of teaching children, not teaching them critical race theory.
And what is critical race theory?
Well, I'm not going to get into the specifics of it because I don't understand it that much, but it's something that what little bit that I know I don't care for.
And what have you heard that you don't?
Well,
that you don't like?
I'm not gonna. I don't have that much knowledge on it, but It's something that I don't care for.
Refreshingly honest. I don't really know what it is. I know I don't like it, but I don't really know what it is. So what is it? Critical race theory, or CRT, how is it being applied in schools? Why has it become such a hot political issue? Joining us is Dr. Rashawn Ray, Professor of Sociology at the University of Maryland and a Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. Dr. Ray, welcome to Planet America.
Thank you for having me.
So, explain to us about critical race theory, where it's come from and what's in it.
So critical race theory is a theoretical framework that emerged decades ago, primarily by legal scholars, but has also been taken up by social scientists. And it has one kind of simple premise, and that is the fact that racism isn't simply housed in individuals, but it's actually housed in our social institutions, in our education system, in our criminal justice system, in the labor market, in housing. And part of thinking about that is that we must be critical in our approach to extend beyond the simple individual explanation of racism and instead look at how racism is baked into our policies, our rules, our procedures, and our laws that then disparately impact people in society.
Okay, now that doesn't sound super scary, but a lot of people are confused about this. So I'm going to read you some quotes from an anti-CRT law that was passed in Oklahoma, has currently been challenged in court by the ACLU. And I'd just like you to tell me, does critical race theory teach any of these things? That one race or sex is inherently superior to another race or sex. That an individual, by virtue of his or her race or sex, is inherently racist, sexist, or oppressive. That an individual's moral character is necessarily determined by his or her race or sex. That any individual should feel discomfort, guilt, anguish, or any other form of psychological distress on account of his or her race or sex. Are any of those concepts critical race theory?
No, not necessarily. So what's important for people to recognize is that because individuals can't oftentimes make sense of the way that racism operates through social institutions, they default back down to the individual level. And at times they can internalize that. And now whether or not people hearing about the history of racism in America makes people sad, makes people feel like that they should be doing something about it, well, we think that's important, but we definitely don't want to necessarily view it as someone getting blamed for it. Now, in a piece that I wrote at the Brookings Institution with Alex Gibbons, we laid out all of these states, and Oklahoma is one of those interesting ones where, similar to other states, they never explicitly mention critical race theory. Critical race theory has become what we call a boogeyman and a catch-all for everything related to racism. And it's the primary point that oftentimes individuals cannot separate their individual identities from the United States as a nation state. And the other thing is also some people are not willing to admit the role that racism plays not only in the lives of other people, but even in their own lives in terms of structuring not just economic opportunities, but also social and cultural opportunities that the United States needs to try to get past.
And Dr. Ray, how would you sum up the way that critical race theory is viewed when projected through the lens of Fox News to parents who understand it to be, my kids are going to school and being told that we're all a bunch of racists?
Yeah, well, we know in a very short period of time, over the past several months, Fox News, at the time we published our article, had used critical race theory about 1,300 times. I mean, they were using it multiple times a day. And when we actually did the analysis, what we found was that critical race theory was used as a proxy for anything that related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And critical race theory wasn't solely focused on race and racism. It also extended to talking about gender, to talking about sexual orientation, to talking about other forms of difference. We know that there have been a series of what we call dog whistles, these kind of silent alarms that go off, particularly to white families, particularly to mothers, where we know that overwhelmingly white women were much more likely to vote Republican in Virginia than Democrat. And part of what has happened is that critical race theory has become this catch-all for everything. And because of that, it is blamed very similarly to the way that defund the police is being framed as being anything related to wanting to make changes to law enforcement. What people have to recognize about the US context is that conservatives and Republicans are much better at messaging than liberals and Democrats. And because of that, oftentimes they control the narrative, even if that narrative is not entirely correct or even remotely correct. It doesn't matter if they can drive that narrative. And that's part of what we saw in Virginia. And I think we've also seen that in some other places as well.
So how do you reach people who only hear what you have to say, mediated through the prism of Tucker Carlson? Or is there no point even trying to reach them?
Cable news viewership and social media is highly polarized. Some of it is actually related to algorithms and the way that they're sorted. A few years ago, I conducted a study with some colleagues looking at a year in the life of Ferguson. Of course, people pretty much point to Ferguson as being the catalyst that created the Black Lives Matter movement in Missouri, where Michael Brown was killed. And part of thinking about that is we found that people might be talking about police brutality. They might be talking about Black Lives Matter, but they are rarely having those conversations with one another. In fact, we examined over 30 million tweets. And of those tweets, we found that less than 0.1% were people in these different echo chambers across the board actually having similar conversations with each other. We found something similar in regards to our recent study on cyberbullying and racism on Twitter and Reddit. So part of thinking about that is I think we have to change the way that algorithms operate, because algorithms on social media are simply set up to reflect back to us what the algorithm thinks we want to see. So it simply drives people farther and farther apart, which oftentimes isn't the truth and isn't good on the left or the right. Instead, there is some place in the middle where people can get more objective information. And I think we have to think about how that comes to fruition. And part of trying to reach people who have been more polarized is that the same way they've been polarized, I'm cautiously optimistic that we can put together search and strategies that can help people get more objective information in schools, also on social media, to at least have a baseline, to even if you're not on the same page, you can at least be in the same book. Right now, people aren't even in the same book. They're not even reading from the same library. And I think that's problematic for thinking about how to move forward.
Dr. Ray, do you understand the concerns of parents who worry that all these people are making decisions about what their children should be taught, and they maybe don't trust the process? Are there enough checks and balances to make sure that whether it's on the subject of race or science or anything else, that this is actually a balanced approach?
I'm a parent, and I think most parents, overwhelmingly, regardless of their race, their social class background, their age, want what's best for their children. I want what's best for my children. But you know what? I also want what's best for all children. And I think that's part of the problem, is that some people want what's best for their kids and aren't necessarily worried about others. But there is a broader systemic problem at play. And that's the fact that in the United States, school funding is primarily driven by property taxes. So what's happened over the past 20 years, 25 years or so, and it's simply worsened, that social class, particularly income inequality in the United States, has increased, and property value inequality has increased. So schools are vastly different. So sometimes you could have a parent saying that something is happening where they are that's problematic, and it might not be happening somewhere else. That's a problem. In the United States, the federal government promises people and promises children an equal education. That is not happening, not just in terms of resources, but also in terms of information and content. And those are the sort of things that need to change. When you're going to school in the United States, you should be getting similar information. Yeah, sure, maybe it's something specific about your state or your city, but overwhelmingly, people should be getting similar information. If you're in California compared to being in New York, Texas, Georgia, or Tennessee, you're oftentimes getting different information, and it spills over into voting, it spills over into people's attitudes, and it spills over into how people think about progress and upward mobility in the United States.
Rashawn Ray, thank you very much indeed for being on Planet America.
Thank you for having me.
Of the many hot takes as to why Democrats did so poorly in Virginia and New Jersey this week, one of the most popular is their failure to pass Biden's massive Build Back Better package, or for that matter, explain what was in it for the average voter. Biden says he would have liked both it and the bipartisan infrastructure bill to have passed before this week's polls and the Glasgow Climate Conference. He says voters need to see results. Still, he's not exactly taking the blame.
Well, I think we should have passed before Election Day, but I'm not sure that I would be able to have changed the number of very conservative folks who turned out in the red districts who were Trump voters, but maybe.
Yeah, not sure I'm buying that passing this bill would have made all that much difference, I have to say. In AP's latest poll, 32% of Americans thought the two spending bills would actually hurt people like them. Only 25% thought it would help them. Even amongst Democrats, only 47% thought the two spending bills would help people like them. Having said that, the not enough explanation theory also checks out. 69% of Americans said they know just some or little to nothing about what's in both bills.
Yeah, for good reason, because nobody knows what's going to be in those final bills, and it's hard to sell something when you don't know what's in there. Moderate Democratic Senator Joe Manchin had a few things to get off his chest on Capitol Hill this week, frustrated that progressive House Democrats still refuse to vote on infrastructure until the Build Back Better bill passes the Senate through the budget reconciliation process.
For the sake of the country, I urge the House to vote and pass the bipartisan infrastructure bill. Holding this bill hostage is not going to work in getting my support for reconciliation bill.
Interestingly, this new cantankerousness from Manchin came just when progressives were proving to be more accommodating. Just that morning, the chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, Pramila Jayapal, had indicated that they were ready to vote for the bipartisan infrastructure bill that they'd been holding firm on until then. In fact, even after Manchin chucked his tanty, Jayapal was still saying that his comments would not impact their decision, and they would still happily vote for both spending bills on the table. Mind you, not everyone was being that charitable. The President's Chief of Staff, Ron Klain, retweeted a tweet that implied his own president's signature bill was an emerging grab bag of ill-designed, underfunded programs that are all set to self-destruct during the second Trump administration. So he's not only trashing his boss's bill, he's predicting his boss is going to lose re-election. Also unhelpful was progressive Cori Bush, labelling Manchin's opposition as, quote, anti-black, anti-child, anti-woman and anti-immigrant. Yet even she didn't say she wouldn't vote for the bills. On the other hand, some House moderates followed Manchin's lead. Bearing in mind now, it's going to take just 3 flipped Democratic votes to sink any bill in the House. At least 5 House moderates say they're ready to block the Build Back Better bill unless it gets a Congressional Budget Office score to analyse its revenue, spending and deficit impacts. Manchin apparently agrees. Look, that's all fair enough, except that would chew up even more time because the House has been told they won't get a CBO score until at least 2 weeks after the final text is ready, which of course it still isn't because they're using this process to determine the final text.
Yeah, it's all a little paradoxical, Chaz. The White House, though, is still sounding confident that a deal will be done. The Halloween deadline, though, has drifted further. Maybe we're looking at Christmas now. Fellow moderate holdout Kirsten Sinema, meanwhile, has signed up to a watered-down plan to limit prescription drug prices after rejecting an earlier sweeping proposal to allow Medicare to negotiate with the big drug companies. This compromise version, which House Democrats have also grudgingly agreed to, will limit the cost of prescription drugs for Medicare recipients to a maximum $2,000 a year. It also includes a $35 a month cap on insulin charges for diabetics.
Look, it will also allow Medicare to negotiate some prices, but only for drugs that have been around for more than 5 years, even longer for more complex drugs like biologics.
Yeah, but at the same time, another part of the reconciliation bill that had looked dead and buried just last week has been handed a bit of a lifeline this week. It may be a short-lived reprieve, though. House Democrat Speaker Nancy Pelosi pushing 4 weeks of federally funded paid family and medical leave back into the now $1.85 trillion social spending bill. But old mate Joe Manchin has already made it very clear he will not support it. So it probably dies again in the Senate. But I guess this move does keep it on the agenda and it does placate progressives. Make him take it out. We're not taking it out.
I'll tell you another reason that it's important to keep paid leave in the bill, at least for now. And that is a number of blue state moderates are desperate to include a repeal of the cap that Trump placed on state and local tax deductions. Trump made it so that you can't claim more than $10,000 worth of deductions for state and local taxes. The idea was to stop the federal government subsidising high state taxes, although some say it was just to hurt residents of high tax states, which are obviously run by Democrats. The thing is, the only people who pay more than $10,000 in state and local taxes and therefore hit the cap are very rich people. So removing the cap is only going to help very rich people. The Tax Policy Centre estimates only 9% of households would benefit from repealing the cap, and the top 1% who make $755,000 or more would receive more than 56% of the tax cut. Just to make that super clear, these are the tax cuts enjoyed by couples earning $10 million a year under this proposal. That's organised by state, as you can see. Hundreds of thousands of dollars each couple. This tax break would cost the government $475 billion, and $400 billion of that would go to the top 5% of households. These tax cuts for rich blue staters would cost more than any other part of the Build Back Better bill. More than the child tax credit, more than childcare and pre-K, more than climate tax credits, more than healthcare funding, and that would cost about the same as the paid leave proposal that Joe Manchin just tried to get rid of because they supposedly can't afford it. So that is why it's pretty awkward to cut that paid leave proposal. Bernie Sanders said, quote, Democrats campaigned and won on an agenda that demands that the very wealthy finally pay their fair share, not one that gives them more tax breaks. Hard to argue with that, but the New York and California Democrats are sure going to try to argue with that, John.
They sure will, Chaz. For more, we're joined by Mark Begich. He's a former moderate Democratic senator from the state of Alaska. Senator Begich, welcome to Planet America.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to hear you, and from far and under.
So Joe Biden is sceptical that even passing the bipartisan bill or the infrastructure bill would have helped out in rural Virginia and gotten Terry McAuliffe over the line. What do you think?
Yeah, I don't think so. First, I'd say this. The McAuliffe campaign was kind of a different campaign. The national issues, I don't think would have mattered, because they really ran a campaign against Trump, which his opponent did not. He ran about education and some other things. And I think that's where people are interested. They want to know what you're going to do, what the issues that you care about. And I don't think the national noise would have made much of a difference. And I think on the New Jersey one, I think that's a lot of voter turnout issue there. But same thing, I think there's an angst in the American population that is, they're concerned about the next year. Our housing prices are going up, inflation, the issue about public safety. These are the issues that people care about. And sometimes what happens in these campaigns, they forget that it's all about, did you put my stop sign back up last week? Did you take the trash? Did you get the trash picked up? That's what people care about. And sometimes candidates take it too far into the other arena. And I think that's what happened in those those campaigns.
So do you think there are any national lessons at all to be learnt from Virginia?
Yeah, I think, well, both of them, but there's two sets of races I would look at. I'd look at Virginia and New Jersey, but then I'd look at the subset. And the subset is mayor races, races around the country and local communities where Democrats did very well. And if you look at what they campaigned on versus the governors, they campaigned on pretty basic things: education, public safety, how to balance the budget, how to improve their community, how to get their community moving forward in a positive way, and new job opportunities for young people in this new economy that's happening. I think if there's anything, Democrats need to keep focused on their message and the issues that they care about: education, making sure there's jobs and opportunity for people, putting money into the infrastructure and rebuilding our economy and rebuilding America. Keep focused on that. All these secondary issues are just, they're distractions. For example, on the infrastructure, the bipartisan bill, they talked about building and doing things. People focused on that. Very positive with the public. Then they moved to this next bill, which is the reconciliation bill. And all you heard about was how big the bill was, how much it cost, and who's going to pay for it versus what's in the bill. And I think the lessons learned here is keep focused on what the average American cares about. They want to know there are opportunities for their kids. There's a job out there for them, that they can make a decent living, that they can purchase if they want to buy a home or rent that's not going to bankrupt them. That's what they have to focus on. And Democrats get sidebarred so quick because they don't keep focused all the time. As a Democrat, I'm telling you from my experience, I've seen it more often than not.
So, Senator, from what you're seeing as to what's happening in Washington right now, is this a process that you feel ultimately leads to the successful passage of the reconciliation and infrastructure bills, or could it all fall apart still?
Well, I think the infrastructure bill, the bipartisan bill, I think gets done. I think there's enough interest in that. And plus, there's reauthorizations of existing money and there's some new money. So I think that gets done. The way that bill had to work is as soon as the House passes the bipartisan bill, that goes right to the president, he signs it, it's done. The infrastructure or the reconciliation bill, no matter what they were going to do, still has to go to the Senate, and then it was going to come back to the House anyway. So I think the House decided the last 2 days, okay, fine, we're going to put what we want in there, send it over, the Senate can mess with it, then it comes back. Here's why I think that bill is going to pass. They have to do the debt ceiling bill. Without the debt bill being taken care of, technically the government could default, and the Republicans will not give the necessary votes to get the 60 votes on that. The only way you can pass that at this moment is you got to shove it into the reconciliation bill and pass it with 50 votes. That's why I think the reconciliation bill still has, air in it. It has opportunity.
Now, the Afghanistan withdrawal is long gone, the Delta surge dissipating, yet Biden's approval rating has not lifted a jot off its record lows. Why do you think that is?
Well, and I would say this, no disrespect to the media, you measure things in like the last 3 weeks or last month. It's a 4-year term. And, I can point to president after president where they've dropped, super low. And then they've come back because their memories are based on what they see in the results. And right now, what they see is Congress and the president fighting, arguing. They don't see or feel the result. They've been in COVID for almost 2 years now, an economy that's all kind of disjointed. And I think people are and I think the president actually said something very interesting yesterday. If I can't remember his exact words, but it was kind of like, almost like everyone should just take a chill pill for a little bit, kind of bring it down a notch. And people feel like they're just under total pressure right now, and we got to help relieve that. So, that's, to me, Biden will still have negatives, but I think you got to wait for after the holidays and all this cleared out area. And then the question is, can they if you recall his first 6 months, very focused on mission. You heard about the economy, jobs, COVID. The economy, jobs, COVID. Now it's everything. It's kind of a eclectic. They got to bring it back together. What are those 2 or 3 things they're going to hammer home? and the technique and the style and the messaging is important. I think that's what they have to get to, or his numbers will be low like this for some time, which will have negative impact to 22 cycle.
Mark Begich, former Democratic Senator from the great state of Alaska, thanks for being on Planet America.
You bet. You have a great day.
President Biden has spent the week on the global stage with the G20 meeting in Rome, followed closely thereafter by the COP26 climate summit in Glasgow. And when in Rome, G20 leaders recommitted to limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, noting in their communique that will require meaningful and effective actions and commitment by all countries taking into account different approaches. Okay. Then on to Glasgow, where President Biden tried to clean up the mess left by the previous occupant of the White House.
I guess I shouldn't apologize, but I do apologize for the fact the United States in the last administration pulled out of the Paris Accords and put us sort of behind the 8 ball a little bit.
And then, just to mix things up a little, there was a lot of talk about methane as well as carbon pollution, and the US pledged to work with the European Union and dozens of other nations to reduce overall methane emissions worldwide by 30% by 2030. The US will focus on methane from the oil and gas sector, which the Environment Protection Agency can directly regulate, so they don't need any congressional action. But not everybody is taking this methane pledge. Australia, China, Russia, India and Iran, some of the world's biggest methane emitters, failing to sign on. Joe Biden told delegates this is the decade that will determine whether mankind avoids catastrophic climate change.
We can keep the goal of limiting global warming to just 1.5 degrees Celsius within our reach if we come together. If we commit to doing our part of each of our nations with determination and with ambition.
But instead of being able to boast about $500 billion worth of new climate initiatives back home, they haven't passed, so he could only hold up the framework that is yet to be passed in a Congress where he looks certain to lose his majority in a year or so. Still, President Biden was trying to sound upbeat.
We'll demonstrate to the world the United States is not only back at the table, but hopefully leading by the power of our example.
A timekeeper's gong adding an appropriately ominous tone to proceedings when the future of the world may be in Joe Manchin's hands. Now, these talk fests can be a bit of a snooze fest too, of course, even when the urgent reality of climate change is the topic of discussion. And maybe it was the long flight on Air Force One or the change in time zones, but President Biden certainly seemed to be in a bit of a need of a nana nap. He's getting very sleepy. Must open my eyes. Ah, to hell with it. Why don't those masks cover your eyes as well?
Look, all I'm going to know is that a recent Pew poll found that 43% of people thought Biden was mentally sharp. Not helping your cause there, Mr. President.
I know, sometimes a good nap sharpens you up. You never know. Look, they may be getting thinner on the ground than the Arctic ice sheet, but climate change skeptics sometimes still hark back to concerns raised 5 decades ago that the world was getting colder. Those fears at the time of a new ice age were hyped by the media. The science behind it wasn't so much wrong as incomplete. They could tell the Earth's climate was changing, they just didn't yet know how or why. It's April 1975. Gerald Ford has been in the White House for 8 months following the resignation of Richard Nixon over Watergate, and the Vietnam War is in its final phase.
The North Vietnamese repeatedly and in massive efforts violated the Paris Peace Accords.
In neighbouring Cambodia, a genocide under the Khmer Rouge is just starting, and in America there's an air of nostalgia for a more innocent time, with Laverne and Shirley and Happy Days on TV, and sentimental country pop from John Denver and BJ Thomas at the top of the charts.
And the feeling just got right for a brand new love song.
Americans had just shivered through 2 particularly cold winters, with heavy snow falling in places where it usually did not, like Texas. Something weird was going on. Since the late 1960s, the emerging environmental movement in America had focused on pollution, the killer smogs, the oil slicks and industrial waste that saw major rivers literally catch fire.
For 2 hours, fashionable Fifth Avenue was off-limits to automobiles and became a crowded pedestrian mall. Autos were banned on busy 14th Street, too, and thousands of persons jammed into Union Square to attend an Earth Day rally.
While the human health implications of pollution were all too clear, the health of the Earth itself was still something of a mystery. Newsweek magazine hit the streets on April 28th with an eye-catching article under the headline, "The Cooling World." Reporter Peter Gwynn wrote about ominous signs that the Earth's weather patterns have begun to change. Gwynn wrote the changes may portend a drastic decline in food production. He went on to cite a survey by Dr. Murray Mitchell of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration revealing a drop of 0.5 degree in average ground temperatures in the Northern Hemisphere between 1945 and 1968. Gwynn also noted a study of satellite images by Columbia University's George Kuckler indicating a sudden increase in Northern Hemisphere snow cover in the winter of 1971-72. Gwynn's article also talked about more evidence of climate change, floods, droughts, and concluded the central fact is that after 3/4 of a century of extraordinarily mild conditions, the Earth's climate seems to be cooling down. So they weren't completely wrong. As we now know, climate change brings extremes of weather conditions within an overall warming trend rather than a cooling trend. A bit like this weather guy, they were still figuring out the technology.
The sleep was not expected. It wasn't until we came to work in the morning it would help. oh boy.
Within a few years, new CO2 monitoring stations were providing more and better data, and experts got a better understanding of what climate change really meant.
If you look at the mean temperature of the globe in the last 30 years, it's something like 3/10 of a degree or so warmer than the mean temperature of the globe perhaps a century ago.
Still, for decades, deniers of human-induced global warming and climate change, like Republican Senator Jim Inhofe, kept bringing up that old report by Peter Gwynn.
The Liberals like to use climate change just in case they're wrong and it ends up getting cooler. Climate change and global warming are actually synonymous. The whole idea is that the alarmists, and I call them the alarmists, the same ones who said back in 1975 that an ice age was coming, we're all going to die, they contend that the weather is getting warmer and has since the turn of the century, and that's due to anthropogenic gases or man-made gases, CO2, methane, and that type of thing.
The science on that now is settled, and experts no longer look at a few weather events like the cold American winters of the early 1970s and make sweeping conclusions, although some politicians still do.
We keep hearing that 2014 has been the warmest year on record. I asked the chair, you know what this is? It's a snowball, and that's just from outside here. So it's very, very cold out. Very unseasonal. So here, Mr. President, catch this.
So, while some of the projections experts were making in April 1975 were wrong, perhaps the most accurate prediction in Peter Gwynn's report was this. Climatologists are pessimistic that political leaders will take any positive action to compensate for the climate change. But maybe that too is about to change.
To the weekly COVID update, not much to report amongst the cases, hospitalisations and deaths. Look, they're all falling slowly, as you can see. The important bit, though, is they're not going up, and this is why. As you can see, it was right now that the big surge was on last year. So every day that American cases continue to fall right now, very good news. Like we suggested they would, federal health authorities have this week given final approval for about 28 million children between the ages of 5 and 11 to receive vaccines. Not that it's going to happen straight away. Only 27% of parents with kids aged 5 to 11 were keen to get them vaccinated right away, according to Kaiser. That's a fall from 34% in September. This, of course, continues America's underwhelming vaccine effort, as is becoming increasingly clear in our states comparison chart. If you combine all the 57 states and territories, ACT is number 1 for the percentage of the total population that is fully vaxxed. New South Wales, number 2. Victoria is into the top 10, soon to be number 3, I suspect. And Tasmania, number 13, even down the bottom of the table. Queensland, Western Australia, Northern Territory are all pretty much into the top 40 almost out of 57. The last critical moment for America, though, is approaching when it comes to vaccines. That is when the employee mandates start. The Federal Register has just published Biden's rule requiring private businesses with 100 or more employees to vaccinate them or test them weekly. Obviously, there's going to be no shortage of court cases over the next few months, but assuming it's not struck down by the courts, we will then either see a lot of vaccinations happening or a lot of people getting sacked. New York's providing a bit of a template because just this week, their vaccine mandate for public sector workers has taken effect. At first, we heard a lot about all the police officers and fireys who are about to get sacked. We were told the New York Fire Department had to shutter 26 fire companies due to staff shortages. But then we found out that the NYPD's vaccination rate rose from 79 to 84% in one day this weekend. And the fire department's vaccination rate rose from 69 to 77% in one day. And the sanitation department's rate rose from 67 to 77% in one day. And it then turned out that no firehouses had been closed at all, although apparently some fire companies do regularly open and close, and some might close more frequently now. I don't know. As for the police, far from the supposed thousands of sackings that were around the corner, only 34 cops and 40 civilian members of the force ended up being put on unpaid leave for breaking the mandate. Less than 0.15% of NYPD employees. Although, to be fair, there are plenty more police who have applied for exemptions, so that number might change. Overall, about 9,000 New York City municipal workers were put on unpaid leave for breaking the mandate. That sounds like a lot. But then you realise there are over 300,000 New York City employees in total. That's only 3% of them. So that might be our template for what to expect nationally. Once again, according to Kaiser, if unvaccinated workers' employers gave them a choice to get the vaccines, get weekly testing, or leave their job, that's what's about to happen. Only 11% of them would likely get the vaccine, according to this poll. If there was no testing option, only 17% of them say that they would get the shot. Now, if they're serious, that's a lot of people who are about to get sacked, John. If they're serious.
Yeah.
We'll see.
Sure will. Rubber's about to hit the road, Chaz. Now, time for a fireside chat. Ah, isn't that cosy? I wish I brought my marshmallows now, Chaz. One thing I've been meaning to point out about this Virginia result, Republicans rightly very, very pleased with Glenn Youngkin's performance. I do doubt, however, their ability to replicate even his selection as their candidate heading into next year's midterms, because crucially, the way that they conduct their primary in Virginia is very different to how most of the primaries are going to be conducted next year. It's not even like a caucus. You basically have 30,000 members of the Republican Party, delegates who form a convention, who vote in remote locations, who choose their candidate. So you end up with a pretty mild-mannered guy like Glenn Youngkin, as opposed to a fired-up Trumpy guy who would more likely emerge from a traditional primary process next year. And the fact that, yes, they all paid lip service to Trump in that process, but they also, obviously, stylistically, sweater vest and all, looked very different. Glenn Youngkin may be the future, but he also may be the past. He may be just this Mitt Romney kind of character who pops out of the woodwork, but we're going to see Trump clones one after the other lined up next year.
Look, that's a great point, that he didn't go through a proper primary process. But having said that, Chattarelli wasn't exactly Trumpy either.
No,
and
refused his endorsement. distance himself from him.
Exactly. So I guess there's a blue state kind of Republican and a red state kind of Republican, which is everything old again, new again, John.
Yeah, it certainly is. Now, interesting events. We've been following this Texas abortion ban, which basically makes illegal any termination after 6 weeks of pregnancy. It's a kind of novel law with penalties. Private citizens can sue, etc. The Supreme Court took another look at it this week, and it feels as though this law is not long for the world.
No, it's not. I'll give you a bit of a background before I get into the Supreme Court stuff, because there are a lot of questions when this law was passed, the effect it would have, and we're actually starting to see the results right now. There's been a few updates. Firstly, we can actually quantify the effects of the law in terms of the number of abortions that people have tried to have versus the numbers they've actually had. It's not quite as many abortions restricted as many feared. Certainly the people trying to get this law overturned, they estimate at least 85% of women seeking abortions in Texas would be affected. But research from September found a 50% decrease in abortions provided in Texas compared to the year before. But it doesn't end there either, because clinics in Oklahoma, Louisiana, New Mexico, Colorado and Kansas have all experienced greater traffic from Texans seeking abortions interstate. Previous research on Texas abortion restrictions suggests about half of the women unable to get abortions in Texas clinics will end up getting them elsewhere. So add up those numbers, there's probably about 25% of Texas women seeking abortions who are being denied what should currently be their constitutional right, about 1,000 women a month. If you're one of those 1,000 women, that's obviously a very big deal. Hence the case ending up in the Supreme Court this week. Now, the interesting thing about this is that they were really strange bedfellows, because one of the groups that were pushing the hardest against this law in the Supreme Court was actually the Firearms Policy Coalition, the gun guys, because they were scared that exactly the same kind of process can be used against guns in California and New York.
So people, even without standing in a case, could be suing.
Exactly. And it turns out that it was a good thing they were there, because Brett Kavanaugh was particularly impressed with the arguments made by the Firearms Policy Coalition. So when you're saying it might not be long for this world, that's correct. Thanks to the gun guys and Brett Kavanaugh, the two bogey people for the left have joined together to potentially get rid of this law. Having said that,
it becomes about the powers of courts rather than the strength of the Roe versus Wade precedent in abortion laws.
Absolutely, and I should say this is going to make almost no difference to the eventual position of abortion laws, because yes, after this, assuming the Supreme Court finds against this law, they'll then go back and have a proper court case, because this is just about whether they're even allowed to sue anyone. They'll go back, sue someone, and they'll probably get this law overturned. But by then, the Supreme Court will have heard Dobbs, the Mississippi case, 15-week abortion limits. That's next month. So they will have limited abortions by then anyway, through a more conventional means.
And a ruling likely in the middle of next year, right in time for the midterms. Now, before we go, let's bust some malarkey.
That's a bunch of malarkey.
Now, I couldn't resist playing a clip from Texas Republican Ted Cruz this week, who was not unreasonably pointing out the hypocrisy of climate warriors like former Secretary of State and Special Climate Envoy John Kerry owning a private jet, or at least his family does. He is married to the ketchup bajillionaire Teresa Heinz Kerry. And the Kerry's Gulfstream jet reportedly spent 22 hours and 22 minutes in the air in the last year. Fox News did some checking on that, and they figured out that was about 116 metric tonnes of carbon. By comparison, a passenger car emits about 4.6 metric tonnes of carbon per year. So it's a lot compared to a car, but it's not like Kerry's flying the plane all around the world. 22 hours of flying time last year, which makes you wonder, why doesn't John Kerry just get rid of this damn plane? But for sure, Ted Cruz had some justification for his very high dudgeon.
John Kerry has a private jet that has flown dozens of times this past year all around the country. I don't know about you, but I don't have a private jet. I don't believe any of the people on this stage have their own private.
Portman does.
Small one. Portman does. He's talking about Rob Portman there, Republican from Ohio, who's also from a wealthy business background. And progressive media seized on that apparent gaffe from Ted, saying, Ted Cruz embarrassed after claims Republicans don't have private jets. Now, strictly speaking, it is true that Ted looked embarrassed there, but as Senator Portman soon tweeted, private jet? Does Delta count? That's Delta Airways. I fly back and forth to Ohio in coach twice a week. So it was a joke about Portman. He's a rich guy, but he doesn't have a plane. Ted was clearly exaggerating as well how much flying John Kerry even does. But ultimately, the malarkey here, or at least the gross hypocrisy, is the fact that all of these politicians fly all the time on private jets. Yeah, they might make a big deal about being a man of the people, getting coached back to Cleveland on the weekends, or that they're some environmental warrior, etc., driving a Prius around Washington, D.C. All of these people fly all the time on private jets owned by extremely wealthy individuals who donate lots of money to them as well, take them to baseball games and everything else. And that, in my view, is the malarkey.
At least until they take me on a private jet.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, sweet. And with that, we're out of time for another trip to Planet America. You'll find more on ABC iView, Facebook and YouTube.
And you'll find this week's Planet Extra podcast in all the usual pod places there. So
bye-bye.